decisions, the UFC show for BetQL. And today we will be previewing UFC 252, Stipe Miocic and Daniel Cormier, the trilogy. Arguably the biggest fight of the year in terms of legacy. It's being perceived as whoever wins this fight will be the greatest heavyweight of all time. I mean, obviously that's up for debate, but that's what's being marketed right now. One thing to note before going into any of this card is that it is at the UFC Apex in Las Vegas, which means it is in the smaller cage, the 25-foot cage, rather than the 30-foot, which doesn't seem like a big difference just saying it out loud, but it actually is. When you do the square footage, it is 30% smaller than usual. And so before we get into the fights, take a look at the betting trends in the smaller cage. I have it up on screen. The finish rate in the smaller cage is pretty significantly higher. It's a 52% finish rate in the 25-foot cage, opposed to a 43% finish rate in the normal cage. There's already been more submissions in the smaller cage, despite there being a pretty good less amount of fights in it. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Finishes have been more common in the Apex, and so just always something to bet. You might be able to get some extra value on people by finish, because getting people by the way of victory always gets you some extra money. But let's get right into it. The early prelims, I believe they start at 7 o'clock on Saturday. There is a fight that I want to highlight. It is Parker Porter and Chris Daukaus. Parker Porter's 10-5, the slight favorite at -115, and Daukaus is coming back at even money. So this is a heavyweight fight. Both fighters are making their UFC debut, albeit on the early prelims. But I think there's a stylistic advantage here, which they always say styles make fights, and especially at heavyweight. So Porter is more of a grappler. He has a couple of submission wins on his resume, a Kimura, Americana, and a rear naked choke. And Chris Daukaus is more of your stereotypical heavyweight, just likes to get in there and throw hands and relies on his power to win fights. And as we can see at heavyweight with people like Daniel Cormier, who we'll talk about later, and then Curtis Blades, being able to wrestle at the heavyweight division is a huge advantage because not many heavyweights have grappling skills. So with Porter being a wrestler, I think that he'll secure some takedowns, get some ground time, and probably point his way to a win, probably unanimously. And so I know it's small names. People probably aren't going to bet on this one, but I think Parker Porter at -115 does have some good value just because I think it'll be a boring fight to watch, but that's why betting's here to make things a little more interesting. Moving on to the undercard, the regular prelims, there is another fight. Virna Jandiroba, 15-1, -290, and Felice Herrig, a staple in the division at 14-8, coming back at +250. Jandiroba is a very accomplished fighter, former Invicta champ. She actually left the Invicta as the champion to come to the UFC. Lost her first fight, but came back with a win. And she is a elite level grappler, high level jiu-jitsu. Of her 15 wins, 12 are submission. The other 3 are by decision, so don't expect her to get a knockout win. But that being said, Herrig has never been finished, so it'll be interesting to see how this one plays out. But it's styles that make fights, like I said, and that's why I think Jandiroba has, I wouldn't say good value at -290, but definitely can be used in parlays to try to get a little better odds if you go for some big favorites. This fight should basically play out as Jandiroba just shooting and shooting for takedowns until she gets one and then working her way to submission. And while it might be boring, it's an effective way to win fights. So one thing to look at. And another thing to note, the line change on this fight, Jandiroba opened at a -150 or -155 favorite and is now all the way down close to -300. So I personally don't see a situation in which Jandiroba loses this one. So it might be useful in parlays, like I said, match up with some of the bigger favorites on the card. But then, since I just gave you guys a big favorite, it's only right I come back with a underdog. And that's where Jim Miller comes into play. He is plus 110, fighting against Vinc Pichel. And yes, that is not a typo. Vince does in fact spell his name that way. Miller's a legend in UFC. Well, legend might be a reach, but he's been around forever. For 15 years in the UFC, he's top 5 in fights, finishes, submissions, all of that. And so he's been around 15 years, and he doesn't even have a bad loss. I know the 32-14 record doesn't look that great because you don't look for people with double-digit losses. But when you go through who he has lost to, he doesn't have a bad loss. It's Scott Holtzman's the most recent one, which Holtzman's not a huge name, but it was fight of the night. It was a good fight. He lost to Charles Oliveira, who is the greatest submission artist in UFC history. Dan Hooker, who's a current contender. Francisco Trinaldo, who's a division staple. Anthony Pettis, who obviously is a legend. Dustin Poirier, one of the greatest in the game right now. Diego Sanchez, also a legend. Michael Chiesa, one of the great grapplers in UFC. Beneil Dariush, who despite not having a big name, is one of the tougher people to fight even now. Donald Cerrone, who I actually think Jim Miller and Donald Cerrone have very similar career paths. Cerrone is a little bit better of a personality to give him a higher resume and bigger fights. But with the way that they've been around forever fighting anybody, they're very similar. Also lost to Nate Diaz, who's a legend. Benson Henderson, who's one of the greatest in the division's history. Gray Maynard, who's a former champ, and Frankie Edgar, another former champ. So just the fact that he has all those names on his resume is something to be said. And I don't think that Vinc Pichel is on the level of those names. Because when you look at it, Jim Miller beats the people he should beat and loses to the people he should lose to. I know the odds say he should lose this one. He's up there in age, but I think that he will win this fight. Similar to the fights I mentioned above, he will be just shooting for takedowns, trying to get a submission, as I believe he has the most submission attempts in UFC history by a pretty significant margin. So yeah, I think that plus 110 is some good value here. I would say the line is about close, but I would peg Miller as a little bit of a favorite. And another thing that worries me about Pichel is that he's been saying that he's looking for a highlight reel knockout, which is something that I don't like people saying, because I think you should just fight the fight instead of looking for a certain way to knock people out, which we will get to later as someone else has been promising the same thing. But yeah, those are 3 prelim plays. I think there's some good value there, definitely on Jim Miller and Parker Porter. And Jandiroba is, I think, a pretty safe bet to win the fight. You can use her in any sort of parlay or straight up, even though you would be laying some decent juice. So on to the main card now. The first fight is a replacement as the Ion Cutelaba fight got removed, and it is Herbert Burns and Daniel Pineda. So Herbert Burns, for UFC fans, you might know the last name. Gilbert Burns, current contender, supposed to be getting a title shot soon. This is his younger brother, Herbert. He's 11-2, minus 260 favorite versus Daniel Pineda, who's been around a while. As you can see, he's got 39 professional fights, and he's coming back at plus 225. And so similar to Herbert's brother, Gilbert, Herbert's an elite-level jiu-jitsu, man. He's 11-2. We got the 7 submissions, 3 decisions, and 1 knockout. So he can kind of do it all, but definitely relies on his jiu-jitsu skills. I would go so far to say that he's elite. Burns by submission is around minus 125, which if you don't want to lay the whole 260, very understandable, as a lot of people are predicting a submission finish and early in the fight. But that just says something how the fight will go. I mean, I don't think this is going to be a close one. But that being said, if you do not want to lay the minus 260, fight to go to decision is at plus 300, which is a lot of value considering it's only a 3-round fight. And I know I said the finish rates are up and Burns is one of the best at subbing people. But, I mean, anything can happen. Pineda's not a bum. He has some decent skills on the ground, so he might be able to not get tapped. But regardless, I think he will be on his back with Burns on top of him for most of the fight. So I think the plays here, if you're looking for value, is Burns by submission at minus 125, or the fights go to decision at plus 300. To go to decision is a little risky, but that is why it's at plus 300. But either way, I don't see Burns losing this one either, kind of like Jandiroba earlier. And so the next fight is a bantamweight matchup, but not the bantamweight matchup that we'll get to later as the co-main. But it is John Dodson and Merab Dvalishvili. Hard name to say. I'll just call him Merab. But Merab's coming in as a favorite at minus 250. He's 11-4, and Dodson, who has been around forever in the flyweight division, recently made the move to bantamweight, 22-11, and a plus 205 underdog. So Dodson, arguably a top 5 flyweight of all time. He's fought all the big names. Would probably be a champ if a man named Demetrius Johnson didn't exist. Lost to him in title fights twice at flyweight, but he moved to bantamweight, and he is 4-4 since rejoining the division. He fought there earlier in his career, but he's fought some tough guys: Marlon Moraes, Jimmy Rivera, Pedro Munoz, and Piotr Jan. Obviously, the current champ, and some high contenders. So one thing here, Dodson is primarily a striker, but that being said, he has fought a lot of top wrestlers and has never been finished. He's lost all of his fights by decision. And some of them, I'd say, are pretty dominant losses, but there's something to be said just not being able to be finished when you're going against the elite of the elite. But Merab is a big wrestler, will be shooting for takedowns nonstop. I think his takedown average is like 9 per 15 minutes or something. I mean, he really goes to try to get the fight to the ground. But with that, he hasn't fought nearly the competition that Dodson has. But he also is probably better right now in their careers and definitely more dominant. I think Merab wins this fight by decision pretty clearly. I don't know if minus 250 is great odds to get him at. I think it should probably be a little bit closer, but not too much. But definitely Merab to beat Dodson. I respect Dodson for being around this long and switching divisions. But you can get Merab by decision at actually minus 170, so not as bad. And that's actually my play. I don't see this fight being finished. I think this goes the distance. So Merab by decision minus 170, you can get some decent value there. And now moving on to the final 3 of the card, we have another heavyweight clash between Jairzinho Rozenstruik and Junior Dos Santos. Now this should be an exciting fight, arguably the most exciting on the card. Rozenstruik's 10-1. JDS has been around forever. He's a legend. No disputing that. Jairzinho's relatively new to the UFC because he was kickboxing for a while. He had a 76-8 kickboxing record, so he's no joke. He has 11 fights in the UFC, 10-1, with his only loss being to Francis Ngannou, who has been on a tear like no one else has been lately. But Jairzinho does have some decent wins. Junior Albini, Alan Crowder, Andrei Arlovsky, and Alexander Overeem. Or Alistar Overeem, my apologies. But yeah, so he's fought some heavy punchers and some decent competition and beat them all until running into Ngannou, which losing to Ngannou is nothing to be disappointed about. But moving over to JDS, he's been around in the UFC since 2008, and he's making a late push in his career for a title fight at age 36. But I just don't think that he is the same JDS as old. His chin has been a little suspect recently. Can't take the punches that he used to be able to take earlier in his career. And Jairzinho is one of the heaviest hitters in not only the division, but the entire UFC. So I think for JDS to win this fight, he's going to have to fight perfect for 15 minutes or get lucky and get a flash knockout. Because I don't know if he still has the power to knock out guys like Jairzinho. And Jairzinho definitely has the power to knock out guys like Dos Santos. And both fighters have said coming into the fight that they're going to sit in the middle and throw hands, which is what people expected. But to hear both fighters say that, it really just seems like a recipe for Rozenstruik to win this one by knockout. I think it'll be earlier rather than later, but Rozenstruik by knockout's definitely a safe play. There's no really extra value on by knockout. As you can see, Rozenstruik's a minus 120 on the fight line and only minus 110 to win by knockout. So I think Rozenstruik at minus 120 is probably the best value on the card because I don't see Dos Santos winning this one. I just don't think he can take the punches that Rozenstruik's going to give out. And so that's probably my best bet of the card, Rozenstruik at minus 120. And with that being said, we will move into the co-main of UFC 252. And this is probably the fight that, if you're not most excited for the trilogy as the main event, this is definitely the fight you're most excited for, because the Sugar Show, Sean O'Malley, is fighting. He is 12-0 and fighting Marlon Chito Vera. And I think this has a lot of hype around it, because I think it's safe to say that Sean is the biggest rising star in the sport. He's 25 years old. He's 5'11", fighting at bantamweight, so he's a 5'11", 135-pound frame, which, I mean, guys like that, just cool to watch. And he's got the crazy hair, blowout afro. He dyes it all sorts of different colors. He's got viral knockouts, throws crazy spinning kicks. I mean, he's an exciting watch. And going up against Chito Vera, who is a step up in competition for him, but not to the likes of like the elite of the division. But this does kind of bring into play some past fights that we've seen where other rising stars, most recently Edmund Shabazian losing to Derek Brunson, that was his first big step up in competition, and also Shane Burgos, who took a less of a step up to fight Josh Emmett and lost that one too. Now, I'm not saying this is going to be like that, but I'm saying there is a recent track record of the rising stars getting knocked out, or not knocked out, but losing when taking a step up. But Marlon Vera is not Derek Brunson by any means, and I think Sean O'Malley is better than both Shabazian and Burgos. So I still like O'Malley to win this. I don't know if he should be the biggest favorite on the card. I think that just goes with the whole aura of Sean O'Malley and the Sugar Show. He's a lot smarter than what he puts on. He's a good fighter. He doesn't make stupid decisions, but he has been saying that he's looking for another viral knockout that would even top his last one over Eddie Wineland, where he had the straight left and the walk-off. And so, like I mentioned earlier, I don't like people saying that they have a knockout in mind, because O'Malley actually said if it goes the way he envisions, it'll be a bigger knockout than the last one. So I'm kind of concerned that O'Malley has some crazy kick that he's going to try to land to finish the fight. I think he should just be fighting and taking what's there for him, because he definitely has the power to knock out anyone in the division. But O'Malley by knockout is my prediction. But I wouldn't be surprised if this fight does go to a decision, because Chito Vera has never been finished and does like to take things to the ground. So some time could be wasted with O'Malley scrambling, trying to get back onto his feet. And so because of Vera's fight style, I think there is some value on O'Malley by decision at plus 185. Could be worth a bet. But if it goes as it probably should, O'Malley should probably get out of there no later than the second round with a knockout. And now moving into the biggest fight on the card, arguably the biggest fight of the year, and also possibly the biggest fight of the heavyweight division's history. Stipe Miocic and Daniel Cormier, the trilogy, for the heavyweight championship. Stipe is the current champ. DC is looking to get it back. And DC, this is supposedly his last fight. He said it before, but it really seems like he means it this time. So he's either going to win and go out on top or go out a loser. But in terms of his career, he is far from that. Just a quick sec on DC's career. I mean, he was, I think, a 3-time state champ in high school wrestling, JUCO national champion in wrestling. I think he was a champion. He was in the championship in college, and I think he lost to Cale Sanderson, Penn State's current wrestling coach. But yeah, 2-time Olympian, Strikeforce champ, 2-time two-division champ in the UFC. So I mean, I personally am not a DC fan, just because of the whole John Jones thing. But that's me. But there's definitely no taking away from what he has done and what he still is, even in the last stage of his career. But yeah, so this is the trilogy. The first fight, DC won by first round knockout, and in the second fight, Stipe won in the fourth round via knockout. But let's not forget that DC was controlling that fight up until the knockout. But DC's resume is literally stuff of legends, even since joining MMA. He's beaten Bigfoot Silva, Frank Mir, Roy Nelson, Dan Hendo Henderson, Anthony Rumble Johnson twice, Alexander Gustafsson, Anderson Silva, Derek Lewis, and then obviously Stipe in the first meeting. And his only loss is to John Jones, who, in my opinion, is the greatest to ever fight, and now the potential greatest heavyweight of all time, Stipe. So he's only got 2 losses on the resume to the top of the division has ever seen. But Stipe also has a good resume. Maybe doesn't quite stack up with DC, but not many people do. Stipe's beaten Roy Nelson as well, Mark Hunt, Fabricio Verdum, Overeem, Dos Santos, who we talked about earlier, dominated Ngannou like no one's ever seen. That was probably his most impressive win, and then obviously has beaten DC in the second matchup. He does have 3 losses, one to Stefan Struve, which I'll be honest is a bad loss, but it was, I think, 6 years ago, maybe more. He lost to JDS, who is no slouch either, and then obviously DC, and that's not a bad loss. And so even though the odds suggest that it's an even fight, and I think it's a very even fight, one thing to note is that the small cage, there were reports that Stipe tried to change it to get it back to the big cage because he was worried about DC's grappling skills, and DC has said in the small cage he's just going to shoot takedowns, single leg, single leg, single leg is what the words that he used. So I think the smaller cage does give an advantage to DC, but Stipe is really not one to run away from anything, so I think he'll be where he would be anyway. I think it's just more of a mental thing at this point, that DC thinks he has an advantage, and Stipe also thinks that DC has the advantage. And also, I don't even know if the small cage would make a big difference in this fight, because DC would probably be trying to push to the inside to make up for the height and reach disadvantage that he has, which is what he did in the first fights too. He wanted to make it a dirty boxing fight. So really it is tough to give a pick on this fight. I lean Stipe by knockout, but anything could happen, man. I mean, DC was dominating the second fight until getting caught just by rushing in. So there's potentially DC plays it a little more safe. I mean, literally, I don't think anyone can give a strong prediction on this fight. It really is even. The odds show it. Most people think so. But one thing that does have some value is I think this will go into the later rounds. I think it will go into the championship rounds. And there is a bet. I don't know if it's available everywhere, but you can look at over-unders. And one bet that I found was if the fight starts round 4, you can get that at -105. So I assume the over-under is around 3.5 rounds, maybe set straight at 4, but probably 3.5. And I think that's a good side to play because, like I said, it's even. I don't feel confident giving out a pick. I do lean Stipe, but I think I'm more confident that it will go late into the fight. So fight starts round 4 is at -105, and I think that's a good value pick. Like I said, smaller octagon. I don't know if that makes an impact in this fight. It should for others. DC will be looking for takedowns, which will prolong the fight, bring it into later rounds, unless he gets a submission. But Stipe has never been submitted, so I don't know if I see that happening. I mean, both guys know what's on the line in this fight. It goes down as who's the greatest heavyweight. So that they're going to be trying to limit their mistakes at all costs. And I think this, if you don't wanna lay on the over under of the fight, and you don't have a side, kind of like I'm in that position, this could be one of those fights where you just sit back and watch the history happen. This is a staple in the UFC's history, and it might be better to just lay off because it's so even. But I'll say it one more time: fight starts round 4 at -105. Does have good value, pretty much even odds, just to say it'll go into the championship rounds, which I think it would only make sense that the trilogy does. The first 2 fights are split. This one could go to a decision. I mean, like I said, anything can happen in this fight, but fight to go into the 4th round is my favorite bet for this fight. And Jim Miller, plus 110. If you hit that one big, which I think it will, that can make up some value, and you don't have to bet on this one. But just one more time, favorite fight of the night is Jairzinho Rozenstruik. I don't see how he doesn't knock this fight out, or knock out JDS and win this fight. So yeah, those are my plays. That's pretty much all I got today. We'll be back Friday, every Friday at 6 o'clock. I'll be previewing the UFC for the weekend. So I'll be here at 6 for people looking for the underdog bets throughout the week, Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. I do NBA and MLB underdog plays for the day. So yeah, thank you guys for tuning in. I recommend getting a BetQL subscription. They got some crazy stats, crazy algorithms, and it works. So if you do sign up with the promo code Mazone, you get 20% off your subscription. It helps you. It helps me. So if you're going to do that, be sure to use the code. And so thank you guys for tuning in, and